So if you grew up in the 90s playing video games, you or someone you knew probably had an original PlayStation. When it came out in the mid 90s, it was the thing to have. Seriously, everyone was talking about the original PlayStation. It used CDs, which was basically magic to us back then, and it had some awesome games. Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, it pulled support for Square from Nintendo and dropped Final Fantasy VII on us. There were a lot of reasons to pick this thing up. But, believe it or not, this is not the PlayStation that I owned back then. My friends actually had PlayStations and I would play them there, and I mostly had a Super Nintendo and then a Nintendo 64, but eventually I did have a PlayStation. It just wasn't this PlayStation, it was the PSOne. Do you remember this thing? It was Sony's first real console revision, and it was amazing back then. I mean, it kind of still is now, but the PS2 Slim, I think, is a bit more impressive, but I mean, considering this was out in, 2000, and it really, I mean, look at how much smaller it made this system. There's also one other funny thing. This is a system that I've never taken apart before. No, really, of all the systems, right, it's this one. And it's one that I have a lot of fond memories of because this is the type of PlayStation that I had back then. This is how I played Final Fantasy VII without having to go over to a friend's house or Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. Like, this was it for me. But I've always looked back on this because I remember being amazed at how much smaller they made it, but I've never actually compared them or taken a look kind of in depth. So I thought we would have some fun today and we take them apart and kind of compare them a bit. Oh, also check this out. I did get this second hand and it looks like it's been through the ringer a little bit. I got it second hand at a convention and I also made them give me the box. Okay, they had it up there and I said, okay, well, if I'm gonna buy it, can I have the box as well? You know, you make some deals at these places. And it's really funny looking at this, by the way, because if we look, they were advertising games like Legend of Dragoon, but also games like NFL Game Day. Do you remember when we had more than just Madden back then, or NHL Face Off, NBA Shootout, and even Grind Session? Who remembers Grind Session, seriously? But then also to read down some of the specs, which they did put on the back of the box, and I don't think the newer systems or anything else will do that, but we're talking about double speed CD-ROM, 2 megabytes of RAM, 1 megabyte of VRAM. And then look, they even talk about all the different accessories down here, like the PlayStation mouse. That's definitely something I never had. But anyway, enough of the nostalgia trip on the box. Let's take a look at the systems. So obviously the first thought going through your head is just how much different these are in terms of sizes, but not just by the length and width, but also the height. If you just drop these next to each other, you can see they also made it quite a bit shorter, which is interesting because I guess the only real thing that would make them similar in size is the memory card slot, like the controller memory card slot kind of stacked on top of each other, but you can see how much higher the original PlayStation had to go up. So on the bottom here, we have 6 Phillips head screws for each one. It looks like the PlayStation, the original one, uses some kind of larger thread screws, and these have some smaller ones, so I'll have to use the smaller screwdriver for that guy there. The screws on the PS1 are way harder to turn out than the original PlayStation. I got this one off in no time flat for that lid. Oh, these are really in there. So massive size difference, obviously, once you take the lid off of here. Something I noticed with these systems is, now that I'm looking at it, in order for the system to know that it's closed, there's usually a little spike that gets pressed down. On this one here, it's right here, so on the PS1. And then on the original PlayStation, it's up here. The interesting thing about that is you can get to this spike without having to pull the lid off. It's accessible if you have this guy open. You can get to it at the top there. You can generally use I think people would use paper clips or something to put in there so that the system thinks it's closed. That way you can take the disc out and put one in, and people would do that to bypass security from what I remember with the original PlayStation. This one, however, is hidden, so you cannot get to it from what I can see with it closed. They covered that up, and the way that works, it looks like, is that when you press this down, we have a little spike here that actually pushes up just enough to press this guy down. That way, I guess Sony figured out that people were doing that. Of course, it was going around the internet and everything as well, from what I remember, and it was kind of being passed around. So Sony, I guess, looked at that and said, well, let's just eliminate access to that little spike. Now, it looks like they both have their disk drive, or their assemblies, laser and assembly, pretty much accessible. It's just kind of floating. Both of them are like that, it seems. So this guy will pop right off as well, just like that. And those are pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy there. But now we get down to the boards and we can see right away. So the biggest difference that really helped them eliminate space definitely came down to the power supply. This entire part here to the left over is all the power supply. And remember, this actually has its power supply external. If you were a proud owner of this PS1, you probably remember this thing. This is the Sony AC Adapter 7.5 volt, and it allowed them to remove the power supply from the PlayStation original, yes, but it also gave us this fun wall wart to deal with, which these were always fun to get, right? Because it would cover up another one of your outlets, especially if it was on like a surge protector. It had to be the last one, but if you had another wall wart, it was like, all right, then let's get move around. I did not like these. I would have rather this been kind of like one of those mid bricks so that it still just had a regular cable. Anyway, I'm looking inside of the PS1 and something I'm noticing very quickly. I don't see any other screws. There is a chance, because I'm noticing these screws are fairly long. Like you can see, these are pretty long screws. I'm almost thinking that they just used 6 screws total for this PS1, which is ridiculous. Let me see, if I lift this guy up, yeah, okay. Well, there's our motherboards. That was quick. Getting to the motherboard on this PS1 is fairly painless, I must say. Now the controller ports are of course soldered to it, so if something gets broken off in one of these, you're not gonna replace it as easily as this guy, which this is of course modular, so this would pop off there. Now the power supply failing on this guy of course would mean this needs to be changed out, whereas this one you would probably just buy another one of those bricks, or maybe even change a fuse out. We got like a big guy right there next to it. It's hard to say exactly what would have to be replaced if it got a zap, but I like to assume that wall wart would probably take a bit of that force. It looks like this board actually just lifts right out as well. Like there is legitimately no screws holding this thing down. Once you take out those 6 screws, that's it. So this board's already out, and we still have quite a few screws to go through on this side. There's also much thicker in terms of the, well, I guess you would say like the heatsink part, or just the overall like skeleton of the system here. That's pretty heavy still. And then again, compared to what we have with our PS1, which is a bit flimsier, it's quite different. And then to get the board out of here, we still have a few other screws here as well that we have to take out. So we're already racking up the amount of screws it takes just to get this board out on the original PlayStation, whereas on the PS1, we're already out. Okay, so with that out, we have our board. And you know what's interesting about this, if you really look at it? They're not that different, right? Like in terms of size. I mean, when you get down to the motherboards, look at that. They're pretty close, aren't they? So what I think is really neat about this is it shows that Sony looked at what they had, which was this board here, and they figured out how they could design the rest of the system around it to eliminate what was basically unused space. I mean, take a look at this case here. If you just cut this part out, that is fairly close to what the PS1 is, right? So if you can take these and you stack them on top of this guy, you remove this power supply, and maybe you shrink it slightly on the top, you would basically have this system here. Really, Sony's been kind of already working with this the entire time. They just decided to refine it heavily with this slim PS1. Now they also seem to have eliminated this kind of this metal in the middle here that's soldered down to it. I'm not gonna desolder it because the chips are the same from what I can tell. Like we have our CPU, our GPU, each one has its own pool of RAM. So we have one megabyte here, 2 megabytes there. Then we even have a chip that's dedicated to the CD-ROM drive. So overall, it's pretty interesting to see that Sony's kind of been working with this board size the whole time. They just had to kind of fix it up, refine it, and then re-release it as a PS1. And then also you have to take a look at how simple Sony made the build for the PS1 versus the original PlayStation. This one has 6 screws in it. This one is 18, like overall. And we also have separate boards with the controller and memory card slots, and then the power supply. Yeah, overall, Sony looked at this and said, we can shrink that down. We just have to start cutting things off and then adding things to the board. I mean, even the power button on the original PlayStation wasn't actually on the motherboard itself. It was on the power supply, which I guess makes sense considering that's where the power is coming from in the first place, but they added it of course, to the PS1 on this side. Now, looking at the placement of the chips, it's a bit different. Whereas on this side, they clustered most of them on the right. This side, they clustered them mostly on the left. I don't know if that has any difference or anything with them putting it together. It's just an interesting thing to notice. Now, it wasn't all good considering they shrinked it down. They did have to remove the parallel port and the serial port, although I don't think I really ever used them, but I do know that there were some accessories and stuff that did. There was even at one point some third-party stuff that came out way down the line that would allow you to play, and I'm not even kidding, Game Boy games off of this parallel port. Yeah, and that's gonna do it here for the PS1. Let me ask you this, when you first started watching this video, did you think that both of these systems would have the same sized motherboard? It's pretty interesting to think about that. I mean, really look at this and say, could Sony have actually released a system this size if they weren't maybe conservative getting into the console space? Or maybe technology did just improve to the point where they could create something this small by using the same motherboard and just kind of refining and working around it. Maybe their console designers even just got better with experience and it led to the PS2 Slim. There's a lot of things to think about there, but either way, I loved the system when it came out. I still like it, and what a cool thing to finally get to do is take this guy apart and compare it to the original. Thanks guys for watching. Make sure you liked the video on the way out if you enjoyed it, dislike it if not, and I'll see you next time.